From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Morning, everyone. My name is Franklin Odo. I'm the acting chief of the Asian division here at the Library of Congress, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here and open the proceedings for a very, very, I think, interesting and informative and pleasant session with Eileen Tabios, to whose work I was introduced earlier this year, and I wondered, why nobody had introduced her to me years earlier, because I felt like I was missing out. Anyway, there are books in the front. I just got one, which I want Eileen to sign, inscribe for me, before we let her go from this particular session. I will have Reme Grifalda, who's a reference librarian at the Asian division, introduce her, because Reme knows her and her work extremely well. But I wanted to just take a minute to tell you about the Asian division and the Asian Pacific-American program. We know and are grateful for the Poetry Center for hosting this program. And later on, you will meet Brian Cohen, who will moderate the Q&A session right after her reading. But I want to tell you that the Asian division has something like 3.1 million volumes in the Library of Congress. Most of our work and all of our work in the past has been in the vernacular, in the Asian languages, from Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Tagalog, Thai, Laotian, South Asian in Hindi or Urdu, or Swahili, not Swahili. We leave that to our African and Middle Eastern division folks. But a few years ago, the division was tasked with the collecting of Asian Pacific American folks, and we are looking forward to collecting from Eileen as well. But we have a modest but growing number of manuscript collections within our division. And so a number of talented and well-respected poets, playwrights, and scholars whose works are coming into our division. We intend to make our division a destination place for people who want to research the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States. It's a growing population. So I want to thank Reme Grifalda for having arranged this event, and I want to introduce her to introduce our speaker. Reme?
Hello, Eileen. Welcome to the Library of Congress. First of all, I want to explain that most people are in retirement parties today, and so they may come in and out during the lunch hour. I met Eileen about 11 or 12 years ago. If any of you want to write a book or you're starting a magazine, you know that in the foreword of your book or in the preface, you have to have somebody important write your preface for you. And if possible, you might as well put it in the front of your cover that so-and-so is giving the preface to your book. This way, if you're the unknown, they may buy your book because they know the person writing the foreword. Well, I was more than a rookie editor when I founded Our Own Voice. And I was stuck with the idea that how can I get people to read this magazine when everyone is a new name? So I turned to my staff. One of us was a writer. Her name was Nadine Sariel. And I told her my problem. I said, we're not going to get anybody to come and visit our website, Our Own Voice, first issue, Maiden. I said, I need a writer. I need an essay. I don't care what they talk about. They can talk about the jungles of the Philippines. They can talk about migration stories, anything. But the writer has to be kind of known. And she said, well, let me see a few. And she mentioned the name of Eileen Tabios. I said, hey, don't know her, but go ahead. So she connected with Eileen, and she came back to me, and she said, you won't believe it. Eileen will give us an essay on a very well-known Filipino artist who passed away a few years ago, and she said she was looking for an excuse to write about this artist. His name was Igarta. What was his first name? Venancio C. Igarta. Igarta was lamenting the fact that nobody knew him here in America, in spite of the fact that he practically invented the color scheme for Monsanto textile. So Eileen came along. She gave a beautiful, more than 5,000 word essay, complete with images, and we had it as our #1 essay. And what do you know? The Filipino literary world paid attention. She also invited other literary icons to come and submit to Our Own Voice. And that's how I met her. And when I saw the piece, I said, I have to go to San Francisco. I'm poor as a church mouse, but I got to go meet this woman. So I went, and she was wonderful. I met her at her apartment. We talked in her kitchen table, and I told her about this idea of a new magazine. And from then on, when I knew her, she had written a book called Beyond Life Sentences. It was my favorite book. And from then on, she now has more than 18 books. And her latest one is The Thorn Rosary. I'm so proud and so delighted to present to you Eileen Tabios. At the same time, we will probably have the reading first, and then Brian, what was your last name, Brian? Because we only met.
Cohen.
Brian Cohen of the Poetry and Literature Center has consented to interview Eileen, and we hope his questions will really punch her so that she answers with full faith and authority. Okay, Eileen, please come.
Thank you, Ramey, and thank you to the Library of Congress and specifically its Asian Division for inviting me to share poems. I'm reluctant to be up here. I'd rather keep sitting down there and listen to you, but I guess I'll share poems. I thought I'd start with a poem entitled Faith, because I've found that to persevere with poetry requires faith in something that cannot be mapped. I've found poetry to be an inexplicable devotion. Faith. Stalactites etching wooden cheeks, statues of weeping saints bobbing amidst waves. You, the unknown port behind distant mist. The image of tears carving wood, of what is this a seed? Include these dreams by a battered mind. Inhale deeply, breathe. To bring the poem into the world is to bring the world into the poem. Did not St. John of the Cross muster a great lyric poem despite severe sensual deprivation? Then exhale the white light off the North Star, constantly whispering, you can always know where you are. Thus moving one hand to my wrist, the other to my waist, pulling me closer to lean against you, my wood. Beloved, what respite exists when I search for you whom I do not know? And Paz notes the link between Christians and Dadaists, for both speak in tongues. And harmony, the essence of music in poetry, produces only confusion. And we are free with each other, though we cannot memorize each other's scent. Love as pure form, and no self is a self. And your mask offers what a red rose offers. Reflection I recognize as my face. My next poem was actually stitched together from fragments written by 40 Filipina writers. I love Filipino women writers, but they don't have as much recognition as the male writers at times. So I made this poem to honor them, entitled Corolla. Sometimes I pray. Love is always haggled before it becomes. I clasp my hands around my disembodied truth. I am forever halved by edges. In group photos, on classroom seats, at mahogany dining tables whose lengths still fail to include me. I play myself perfectly, containing a Catholic hell within my silence to preserve the consolation of hope. Hope. Once I took Bing cherries into a blue bowl until I felt replete in the red overflow. If my bones were hollow like flutes made from reeds, I might savor the transcendence of Bach flowing through me rather than the fragile movement of marrow. These are thoughts which occur only to those entranced by the layered auras of decay, my mother scolds me. I agree, but note the trend among artisans in sculpting prominent breasts on immobilized Virgin Marys. She replies, but these are moments lifted out of context. The green calyx emphasizes the burden of generously watered corollas, though beauty can be emphasized from an opposite perspective. I have no use for calm seas, though I appreciate a delicatesse of moonlight as much as any long-haired maiden. You see, my people are always hungry with an insistence found only in virgins or fools. It is my people's fate for focusing on reprieves instead of etched wrinkles on politicians' brows and mothers' cheeks. We are uncomfortable, encouraging dust to rise as tears. Attempt witnessing pain as wine staining silk, a gray wing, then gray sky. Only God, I begin to whisper before relenting to the tunes hummed by ladies with veiled eyes. The definition of holidays becomes the temporary diminishment of hostile noise. I do not wish to know what engenders fear from fathers, even if it means one must simulate an aging beauty queen clutching photos of tilted crowns. I prefer to appreciate from a distance those points where land meets water. I prefer the position of an ignored chandelier. When lucidity becomes too weighty, when the calyx sunders, I concede that I make decisions out of diluting my capacity for degradation. I frequently camouflage my body into a Christmas tree. I cannot afford to consider suit-faced children stumbling out of tunnels dug deep enough to plunge into China's womb. You say, the rice cooker is flirting with its lid. I say, I am drowning in air. I have discovered the limitations of wantonness only in the act of listening. There is no value in negative space without the intuitive grid. I am called Balikbayan because the girl in me is a country of rope hammocks and walling orchids, a land with irresistible gravity because in it I forget the world's magnificent indifference. In this country, my grandmother's birthland, even the dead are never cold, and I become a child at ease with trawling through rooms in the dark. In this land, throughout this archipelago, I am capable of silencing afternoons with a finger. In this country, where citizens know better than to pick tomatoes green, smiling grandmothers unfurl my petals and begin the journey of pollen from anthers to ovary. There, stigma transcends the mark of shame or grief to be the willing recipient of gold-rimmed pollen. In my grandmother's country, votive lights are driven into dark cathedrals by the flames of La Luna Naranja, a blood-orange sun. In the prior prose poem, that last line, La Luna Naranja, is deliberately mistranslated to be blood orange sun rather than moon. I like tinkering with so-called mistranslations. So-called because the same word can mean different things to different people. My next poem is Vulcan's Aftermath. Skyscrapers implode as streets buckle. The city is torching its ancient violins. If only I comprehend why we must meet in hotel rooms with monograph towels, with stationery embossed silver by French lilies. Why are you addicted to lobbies edged by blue marble rooms sprouting yellow grass, where all lucre is filthy, where hovering waitresses look underage except for their breasts, or where skirts split? Which Frenchman said the most erotic span is where a breech reveals female flesh? The midriff between sweater and jeans? The cleavage when a blue velvet blouse is unbuttoned? I can still feel the callous tips of your fingers clawing there. There must be another section of this city where even you would be at ease with revealing your face, where you would touch me from a motivation that excludes fear of mortality, where, as a poet has whispered, flowers need never be ferocious, where there is no such thing as invisible ink, where, as a poet has whispered, carnivores forget their nature. There must be another neighborhood where cherry blossoms never miss their seasons. Yet the flames continue rising, and now the sky cringes from black smoke. An angel sacrifices his wings only to be jailed by the mayor and 3 senators. I raise my hand to beckon a waitress, my diamond ring beaming forth rapiers that slice at light. I summon a girl with red hair who reeks of lilac perfume. The split on her skirt reveals a ziggurat tattooed on her inner left thigh, but I am most struck by her eyes. They lack color, and I am felled by this evidence of a life force dissipating. If only the city has not spent a century squandering its water supply. If only women were still expert at wearing their hair up. If only blue velvet never slithered off my shoulders. If only your hands were not chilled by the acts of former lovers. If only my mother believed Rapunzel wants to be isolated in a turret. If only Vulcan retained humility after he discovered fire. If only men in dark suits paid pale boys to go to school instead of boxing with each other bare-fisted. So that fire poem was actually inspired by a painting of 2 boxers. But while a figurative painting can offer many sources of reference, what if the image is is simple as a monocolor, for example, a single color, and I was thinking maybe the face of a bit of jade. So to explore the question, I wrote the next poem I'm going to share, which is entitled Jade. I can see how I've misinterpreted the fall of night. Against a Grecian urn, shadows sunder. The clay is ageless, and I ache to press my forehead against it. Once, I stopped a burn on my fingertips by peeling a grape. I forced perfection on its nakedness. It is so difficult to find innocence in accomplished men. There is always something to be paid. Once, someone asked for my views on fidelity. Upon confirming the questioner was not discussing radio waves, I nodded and proclaimed with gusto, "Sexual fidelity is an admirable trait. I believe all my lovers should possess it." I never show my scars, though allow an occasional easing of pressure with a flushed countenance. My favorite stone is jade for the impassivity of its face. Perhaps I will meet an optical illusion that is solid, that would surprise me like a boulder sporting a black bowler hat. My friends are astounded at my naivete. I met a man attending a party without his wife. I was the only one who believed there was no foretelling. But I remember when I too paid attention to symbols. I can't recall the beginning of when I stopped, and I no longer believe in the humility of monks. Perhaps it's obvious by now, but in many of my poems, I'm not trying to say something specific, deliver a message. I'm just trying to evoke a feeling. Come knocking. You quirked an eyebrow when I said I loved the flag. What else can be summoned when you have never seen me drop a smile? Then you admired the cherries hanging from the ears of a lady behind me. But as I turned my back, I felt you raise your hand before it sadly lapsed. Someday we will discuss, you promised. It makes me order a drink. I know you admire encaustic for protecting forever the fragility of paper. But my friends begrudge you. Your blue shadows repel them, and they weep as I dive into the deep end. I once rode an elephant through a field of tall grass. I laughed at a bear baring its yellow teeth. My guide was a pygmy who called me sir. My arms grew wiry, tugging at rope. That evening, welts rose on my palms, and I soothed them with the wet walls of a beer bottle. What is the surface of reality? Do not our ancestors matter? Life so transcends one's intention. With what are we grappling when we are not sleeping? Why need we grapple when we are dreaming? How difficult it must be for you. And still, I must come knocking. These last two poems I want to share are reconfigurations of the Rapunzel fairy tale. The first was inspired by an epigraph by Clifford Geertz writing on Foucault, where he said, "Stairs rising to platforms lower than themselves, doors leading outside that bring you back inside." Rapunzel and Wrapped. She locks the entrance to the turret containing 1,000 diaries, whose papers are yellowed and leather covers cracked. Then she feeds the key to an alligator. She is outside where ants clamber up the velvet folds masking her thighs. She actually scents grass. She understands gloves are old-fashioned, but has resigned herself to certain constraints. It takes time for the ink stains on her hands to fade. But she has crossed the moat. As she peers at the stolid gray tower that she once draped with her hair, that a man once climbed, she shivers but smiles. First, she must eliminate her guides. Her godfather, an emperor of 2 continents and the eagles overhead, has sent a troop of retired generals. She can feel their white beards swaying as they urge black stallions toward her. She can hear the horses gasp as effort glazes a wet sheen over their hides. Though the shimmer of air in the distance simply may be the temper of a summer day, she lifts her skirts and breaks forth into a run. Once, a man buried his face into her shaking hands. She treasured the alien rush of warmth against her fingers as he spoke of sand, gritty but fine, of waves, liquid yet hard, of ships, finite spaces, but treasured for what they may explore, of ocean breezes, invisible but salty on the tongue. "Like the potential for grief?" she asked. He raised his eyes in surprise, and she captured his gaze. She pressed on. "I have read that grief is inevitable with joy." Still, she woke one day to a harsh rope dangling from an opened window, and emptiness was infinite by her side. Now she is taking the path opposite from the direction she saw the man choose when he departed. As his hands left the rope, he looked up and saw her lack of bitterness framed in the window. The forest respected her grief with a matching silence. But she had learned from the Egyptians how to measure intangible light, a lesson that revealed the earth to curve. Now she runs, and as she begins to gasp, she can feel the sand between her toes. The breezes tangle the long strands of her hair, and the waves weight her skirts. and as she begins to feel his ship disrupting the horizon. A sheen breaks across her brow, and she feels her lips part. Enwrapped, she knows she soon will take off her gloves. Enwrapped, she feels she is getting there. And the second Rapunzel poem, the last I'll share, has an epigraph by Luz Irigaray, who once wrote, "A stake, an axis, is thus driven into the earth in order to mark out the boundaries of the sacred space in many patriarchal traditions. It defines a meeting place for men that is based upon an immolation. Women will, in the end, be allowed to enter that space, provided that they do so as non-participants." Against disappearance. After she climbed down the tower, Rapunzel looked at the welts rising on her palms. She had not expected the burn inflicted by the braided rope. Still, she allowed her tears to water the red tracks that began her new journey, for she had learned that bliss is possible only to those who first experience pain. As the salt of her tears stoked the fire in her grasp, she pronounced to the doves she felt lurking among the high branches of surrounding trees, "One must fly toward the space where the distance towards the horizon can never be measured." Once a man dodged the floating spotlights of her guards to climb towards the window of the turret where she spent her days in velvet gowns, living through words she read behind covers of cracked leather. She was surprised, as she had not thrown down her hair, which remained pinned under her inheritance of gold combs festooned with diamonds, rubies, emeralds, and pearls. "Don't move," he ordered as he walked towards her. "I want to memorize the way you look before your hair will fall from the pleasure I will teach you." And as the sun's departure stained the sky beyond her window, her hair fell, and her lips moved, and her gown slipped down her shoulders to reveal the silk and lace woven by those who once served her ancestors whose portraits adorned her walls. She looked at her father and nodded slightly to acknowledge the foretelling of a frown the artist had painted on his brow. But her hands rose to grasp the man tighter against her breasts as she whispered, "Before the first one, how does one know sin?" The shadow of a dove in flight interrupted her reverie. Her tears ceased, and she wiped her palms against the velvet covering her thighs. Then she lifted her skirts and danced down a gravel path whose unknown destiny she did not mind. She danced with a swath of silver butterflies who appeared from nowhere and lingered over her smile, until an old male dwarf from another fairy tale popped his head from behind a boulder by the bend of their path and asked, "Who are you?" She proclaimed with glee and pride, "I am Rapunzel," to which the dwarf replied, "Nonsense, Rapunzel has long hair." And she laughed and announced, as she twirled in a circle so that her skirts flared high, "I cut my hair, braided it into a rope, and used it to escape my turret." Amazed, the dwarf said, "How did you think of that idea?" Rapunzel stopped her dance, fixed a cold stare at the dwarf, and hissed like Clytemnestra, "When women control their destinies, they are only exercising a law of nature. How dare you be surprised?" Thank you for listening.
Eileen, I'm so glad you're here today. I've seen your work endorsed over the years by a number of poets that I admire, and somehow never quite got around to actually picking up the book, but having had the opportunity to read the Thorn Rosary, I think we're very passionate about it. So, I'm glad we're here to celebrate the poems, and, obviously we're also here to celebrate Asian American poetry, or as we like more accurately say, I guess, Asian American poetry. So I thought I'd start off biography and into your work, like how do you think the experience of moving to the United States that age and being surrounded by new culture, I don't know if it was a new language or not. How did those initial encounters you sort of start to shape the identity of the white man?
I mean, it's interesting. I never really thought to explore my identity as a Filipino-American until I became a poet at age 35. And to move here to the United States at age 10 was, if I recall correctly, fairly seamless, partly because English was the language of education in the Philippines. And as I started to explore identity, and I'm using words as my raw material, I was very taken by the notion of English as a colonizing language, because in the history of the Philippines and the United States, after the United States became Philippines' colonial master, they partly manifested colonialization by forcing Filipinos to use English as not just the language of education, but the language of commerce, hence the language of everyday life. So English was used to manifest the United States' desire to extend its empire. So later, as a poet, as I started writing poems, and the only language I'm fluent in really is English, and knowing the history of English for my birthland, I started writing a lot of so-called abstract poems where I think I once said I wasn't interested in conveying a message. I was just trying to evoke a feeling. Sort of like an abstract painting. You don't know what the painting's about, but there's something that moves you from abstract paintings. The reason I took that approach is because the opposite of colonizing is to make things uncertain. You're not telling something, you're not forcing a message on something. So the opposite of that, to me, was the type of stringing together of words where the meaning was permanently in flux. And really up to the reader, each individual reader or the audience, which is sort of the opposite of someone colonizing an audience by force-feeding a meaning into them. And that's how I explored identity for poetry, by trying to disrupt what I sensed was the conventional dictionary definitions of words. But then poetry, I would later learn, once I get past that needy poet phase, poetry has its own language anyway, so it also lends itself.
Well, I guess, yes, sir.
I have to leave in a
Yes.
little bit, but I wanted to tell you how much I enjoyed the reading,
Thank you.
and I look forward to reading the book. But I wanted to ask, how do you think having adopted 2 children will impact your writing? Where do you think this might lead you?
I adopted, for people that don't know, my son from Colombia about more than 2.5 years ago, and I adopted a daughter just 3.5 months ago, both twins, they're teens. And they come from Colombia, and when they landed in the United States, they did not know English. So the immediate obvious example is, again, the notion of being part of a process where you're guiding someone to learn English, which is actually not the easiest language in the world to learn. And the frustrations that come forth, the gaps that start to exist in when communication fails. And so that actually heightens my feelings of responsibility for word choice in poetry. And the second impact is that whereas before I was talking about not necessarily wanting to convey a message, I actually now, with post-adoption poems, I'm very interested in conveying certain messages, one of which is that it's my own opinion that the situation with orphans around the world is the greatest humanitarian tragedy of our time. Estimates for that number has risen over 200 million, depending on how you define orphan. And so that kind of statistic is lost behind some of the more immediate impacts of, say, natural disasters like tsunamis or even wars. If you take a look at the number of orphans around the world, to me that's something that I wouldn't mind drawing your attention to, if I can do say poetry, that's fine.
So about the end, is not just an act of love, but actually sort of an extension of the political consciousness that you're showing in poetry.
Well, of course, it's never all seamless. I mean, it's all seamless. If the type of person you are is partly reflects your politics, then it's not so clear cut as, oh, I think we should help people and therefore. I mean, there are many ways of helping people without adoption. So I wanted to do that.
Speaking of love, in 2005, I published a book called I Take the English for My Beloved. And I'm interested in what you're talking about with English as, colonizing English, the language is colonizing English. I would imagine that must be like kind of a complicated road.
Well, when I say deliberately, I take the English for my beloved, it's because to be a colonial subject is also to remain mired in colonial history, and I wanted to get beyond that. I think a Filipino is more than just the influence of the colonial past, and I certainly wanted to see that play out in my poems. And since English is the language I'm working in, I didn't want to have an adversarial relationship with it all the time. I actually wanted to love material. And a lot of the post-colonial aspects of my work was when I was a younger poet. I mean, I think with time and maturity, you take a larger stance to the work. And as I said, poetry is its own language, and it's not post-colonial just because it was never colonized. It's just its own thing. So.
Well, building on that, Rebecca, do you have a question?
I wanted to know the background of why your book is called The Thorn Rosary.
I think I read a poem where I said to bring a poem into the world is to bring the world into the poem. And so I put together a manuscript that became this book. And I stumbled across this quote by Archbishop, and it's a quote by this gentleman I'd never paid attention to before, but I decided to use it as an epigraph and also take a title from it because I found the excerpt from his words inspiring. And I think, I collage a lot of things into my poems. I don't judge the sources. I just, if the words themselves resonate for me individually, I'm moved by them. So I titled this book Thorn Rosary because of this quote by Archbishop Fulton Sheen, which says, "The Rosary is the book of the blind, where souls see and there enact the greatest drama of love the world has ever known. It is the book of the simple, which initiates them into mysteries and knowledge more satisfying than the education of other men. It is the book of the aged, whose eyes close upon the shadow of this world and open on the substance of the next. The power of the Rosary is beyond description." And so even though I'm not Catholic, I was moved by that.
You spoke a little bit about your preoccupation with mistranslation while you were reading. Can you talk a little bit more? Do you see that as to whether you see that as an act of subversion, like you do some of the other more political elements of your poems, or is it a different thing? Can you explain a little bit?
Sure. Now, the Spanish phrase that was mistranslated in the poem, it was Spanish. And if we recall, Spain was a colonial master of Philippines for about 300 years. And in the process of that period when the Spaniards were colonizing the Filipinos, there was a term, from scholar Vincente Raphael, who once described how Filipinos would listen to the Spanish and then pluck out words from the Spanish. They didn't know what it meant, but they liked how it sounded, and so then they would mimic the Spanish, and Philippinize the Spanish, which is a reversion. They would colonize the Spanish, reversion of the other way around. And so I thought, well, I'll leave it around now. If I mistranslated that, if I therefore gave my own definition to Spanish, which was talking back against colonialism from a historical standpoint. that was part of our study. But of course, more generally speaking, the notion relates to, subjectivity and how, people can interpret the same thing many ways and so on.
Well, maybe another question about the word. It's billed as selected prose poems. So I guess it's kind of two questions. First of all, what is it about the prose form that you find so interesting? How do you sort of take advantage of that? And also, do you consider all the poems in the book to be prose? Because I'm seeing in the Latin punctuations on Japanese keys, poems that outside of this book, I wouldn't readily identify.
So, the Thorn Rosary has a selection of prose poems written over a period of 12 years. And a lot of the early prose poems are, if you will, conventional prose poem form, paragraphs, words. And I like the prose poem form initially because the elimination of the line break meant elimination of the pause as I read them out loud. I like the long lines. I like feeling them and I like reading them. And the long lines, for me, evoked many things, one of which was the infinity of the horizon, and I believe the historic citizen. But the other is the influence of the visual art, abstract expressionism. I wanted to write prose poems like The Wandering Sea and abstract painting, where the brush strokes have so much energy they seem to go past the edge of the canvas. And if you actually look at my prose poems, sometimes the last sentence is missing a period. That's because I wanted to convey textually the idea of the sentence or the poem continuing on past the limits of the page. So I was trying to evoke abstract expressionist painting there. In the later prose poems, they don't look like prose paragraphs. They might even look like fevers, their lines. But when we talk about meaning and subjectivity, you can picture a page where you have fragments, phrases of the phrase. On the white spaces around these fragments, what look like lines in free-verse form. To me, that's the reader filling in what's actually the significance of these phrases that I've written out. So to me, it's all actually one page, all filled with something. The white space is not blank, it just looks like white space. So that's the prose continues. But this time filled in, not by me as author, but by the reader.
It's a space for participation.
Yes, space for participation, exactly.
So, I mean, how would you distinguish that, like, the way you sort of approach abstract art and metaphor, what you do? John Asbury is like part of the sort of associated. So do you see similarities between what you're doing and John Asbury might be doing relative to?
Perhaps in our love for the form, but not really, and in fact, I deliberately, I love John Asbury's poems, but I did not start reading him until much after I developed what I was doing. Just by coincidence, he wasn't among the initial group poets that I was reading when I started out as a month later. I would say one of the major differences is that his sense of rhythm is much more overt than mine. So I think we're very different, although I would certainly have a lot of fondness as well as respect for his works.
I guess he's got like a certain kind of lyric sway that is like appropriated from the romantic, but sort of turned on its head. But I sort of, in the way that we just do line breaks, there's a way of maintaining momentum. Those line breaks are really crucial to the best way of that. That kind of stuff. Oh, yes.
I know that you were saying you had become a poet at 35, and I was wondering if it was something that you had always loved poetry, or had you gone to school for it, or what sparked at 35 that interest in dedicating? Because I mean it's not easy to be a poet.
Well, I know that I've always loved words from the beginning. And my first career, I was a journalist just because I loved writing. At age 35, by then I was my full-time job was a banker, and I was trying to switch careers if you want to become a creative writer. And I assumed that as a creative writer, my form would be a novel. In fact, I retired from banking and I put the words "and" on the bottom of a murder mystery novel set in a bank. It was atrocious, but I didn't know that back then. And so I quit banking, and then I thought I'd relax for a bit before going back into writing a novel. And I thought I'd take that summer off and do something easy, like poems. And so, I was meticulous about getting up in the morning and spending 9 to 5, about 9 to 5 banking hours at the kitchen table to either read or write poems, because I didn't want to get hooked up in, soap operas or anything like that, now that I was newly working at home. And what was interesting with hindsight is that by the end of the summer, when I thought I would put mood poetry aside, that was my summer relaxation, go on to something serious, I realized that actually poetry was the form I've been looking for all my life. So I'd done many, many types of writings, but I had never been, for whatever reason, interested in the poem itself until that summer when I was 35, and then I realized, okay, this is actually what I've been looking for. So I always think that poetry chose me at the end of the day.
Well, I do want to ask you about Biography, which is an online journal of reviews ostensibly, but you're very careful to distinguish what you do from reviewing, which we associate with evaluation. You call your own contributions conceptual engagements. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that distinction between reviewing and engaging, why it's important, and sort of how you feel that you should approach poetry.
Well, I mean, it's not a secret that poetry is not one of the best-selling art forms in our culture. So I wanted to do a poetry review journal so that there would be another venue for people reviewing or interacting or engaging or responding to poems. I differentiate myself, what I write about poems, I call them engagements rather than criticism, because there's a whole slew of large school of thought on what criticism should be, what a critic's role is, and I wasn't interested in any of that. I also thought that engagement, if you read a poem, you could engage theoretically with just part of the poem, not necessarily the whole thing. And if you wrote about that, your own engagement with that, it would often not be good enough by the standards of criticism. So I wanted to have the freedom to engage with any poem in any way I felt, whether it's to engage with the totality of the poem's body or just part of it, and to engage in any way. I don't think one can force a person to react to any form of art in any certain way, in any predetermined way. I mean, it's up to that person, because the reaction to art is as much defined by who that person is, and not just the artwork. So it seems to me, I didn't want to have standards for reviewing. That kind of negates the identities of the people who are reading the poems or responding to art. So I didn't know that makes sense.
Well, it's a great website, and if you get a chance to check out galaxyreverx.blogspot.com, is there anybody you've been particularly excited about in doing this website? What poets you encountered that you now have a sustained relationship with?
No, I mean, also that project is part of my impossible goal that as a poet, I want to read every single poem I've written. I mean, that will never happen, but that's the goal. So I was open to all sorts of poetry.
Yes. We can start a book signing. This is for Franklin. The books are outside for sale. If you'd like to pick up a copy, then you can come inside and read some. Or we can go outside.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.